Blackmagic Pocket 6K camera is here. Yesterday, Blackmagic announced the update. Got quite some things to talk about. I think the key takeaway for me is that it's almost the perfect run and gun cinema camera. I'll get to that in a bit, but let's talk some specs first. The most important update in this new camera is the full frame sensor. A lot of filmmakers have been asking for this, and Blackmagic has finally decided to put this in their updated camera. You can shoot 6K up to 36 frames per second and 4K up to 60 frames per second. Now, the new Pocket camera has a different mount. It's the L mount, and Blackmagic has decided to join the L mount alliance, including Panasonic, Sigma, and Leica. I think the reason Blackmagic decided to join the L alliance is because you, as the end user, will have more choices in terms of lenses. Lens manufacturers will know that once they make an L mount, it'll be compatible with multiple brands. The new mount unfortunately means that we have no more internal ND filters. They just couldn't make it work with the way the L mount is set up. Now we also have CF Express memory cards instead of CFast, which is pretty welcome because it is much more of a common standard in the film industry. This also means that you're going to be less reliable on external SSDs when shooting. Obviously, CF Express is more expensive, but again, you will have a much more portable setup where you can just shoot on a CF Express internally. Now, the body of the camera looks more or less identical. It has more or less all the same ports that the previous version has. Now, Blackmagic did mention that they have fully redone the internal electronics of this camera, and I was hoping that if they were going down that route, they would actually do a more significant redo of this camera, because this camera now is almost the perfect run and gun cinema camera. To illustrate that point, let me talk to you about something which I call the holy trinity of run and gun cinematic shooting. There's three kind of core things I would want from a camera: internal compressed RAW, which also the previous version of this camera had, a pleasing cinematic color science, which Blackmagic provides, and finally, autofocus and in-body stabilization. And it looks like we sort of have autofocus if you look at the spec list of the new camera, although Blackmagic didn't really mention it or highlight it during the announcement, so I wonder if they've made any real strides there. And finally, IBIS or in-body stabilization. Now, the Blackmagic camera does have gyro, but I've seen from tests from other users, it looks like the gyro stabilization is just not good enough on this camera. At the very least, I was hoping that Blackmagic would at least announce new and improved gyro stabilization. They also didn't really mention that, so I am assuming that we more or less have the same basic gyro stabilization that was in the previous camera. Now, again, I am really happy with this new camera. It costs the same as the last, which is great. You have more or less a superior camera for the same price. After 3 years, you could say, well, that was kind of long awaited, but still. But I would have really wanted Blackmagic to make that final stride, to make this camera a real run and gun cinematic shooting camera, which means to have a solution to stabilization, whether that's IBIS or whether that's gyro. To me, that doesn't really make a difference, but to have a above average level of stabilization would have been great, and to have autofocus improvement would have really made this camera almost impossible to beat, especially at that price point. I would go as far as saying that I'm willing to pay $1,000 to $2,000 extra to have proper autofocus and proper stabilization, because then I will have truly powerful camera that can serve two purposes. It's your typical studio cinematic camera, and I can pick it up and take it anywhere with me, especially outdoor filming, especially travel filming. And I'm hoping that in the future, Blackmagic will provide us proper autofocus and proper stabilization. Now, I do understand that, you know, from Blackmagic's perspective, this is a tricky choice, because if you really provide that full all-round camera, there's a risk that this camera is going to cannibalize their higher-end professional cinema cameras. Because once you have a 2-in-1 camera that can both double as your studio camera as well as your run-and-gun camera, how likely are you going to be buying, let's say, an Ursa or a Red Komodo? And this is the challenge that most of these cinema camera makers are facing. This is why Red sued almost every camera company to prevent them doing internal RAW in run and gun cinema cameras. They most recently lost from Nikon, who's been providing that. And basically what we'll see increasingly is that cameras will become smaller, more run and gun. You'll have much more of the compatibilities of more expensive cinema cameras in smaller bodies. So I think that is just the future. For Blackmagic, it would be better to have them cannibalize their own higher end cameras than to have other brands jump into that space. With that being said, I have to say I am very happy that there's finally an update. I will be buying this camera once it hits store. I'm very curious to see how the full frame sensor is going to help me make much more immersive, interesting cinematic film.